The dealer barely looked up when the old man set the record sleeve on the counter. He had been doing this for 22 years, and he could tell in the first 3 seconds whether something was worth his time. The sleeve was worn at the corners, the vinyl itself scratched in the way that records get scratched when they have been played too many times by someone who loved them too much. He picked it up, turned it over, looked at the signature on the back cover, and set it back down. "It's a fake," he said. Springsteen never signed in blue ballpoint. Always black Sharpie. This is a reproduction sleeve, probably printed in the 90s. I'll give you $40 for the record itself if it's not too warped, but the signature's worthless. The old man standing across the counter was 63 years old, gray-haired, wearing a jacket that had seen better decades. He looked at the dealer. He looked at the record. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands with the particular care of someone holding something that has been theirs for a very long time. "I was there when he signed it," the old man said. The dealer smiled the smile of someone who has heard this sentence many times before. "Sir, I'm sure it feels that way. But I've been authenticating signed memorabilia for 22 years. The ink is wrong, the pressure is wrong, and frankly, this sleeve has been handled enough that even if there had been an authentic signature at some point, provenance would be impossible to establish. Best I can do is 40 for the vinyl." The old man nodded slowly. He set the record back down on the counter. He didn't say anything for a moment. His name was Thomas Heller, and he had been present at the Paramount Theater in Asbury Park, New Jersey, on March 14, 1973, when a 23-year-old Bruce Springsteen had played to an audience of roughly 200 people in a room that smelled of cigarettes and spilled beer, and the specific electricity that precedes something becoming important. Thomas had been 20 years old. He had driven from Trenton with 2 friends who had already left by the time the show ended because they had work in the morning. Thomas had stayed until the lights came up. He had waited by the stage door afterward. There were 4 other people waiting. Springsteen had come out 40 minutes later, in jeans and a flannel shirt, carrying his own guitar case. He had stopped for each of the 5 people. When he reached Thomas, Thomas had been holding the album, not yet released, an advance copy a friend had obtained through a connection at the label, and Springsteen had looked at it, laughed, and said he wasn't entirely sure how Thomas had gotten that, but he'd sign it. He had signed it with the blue ballpoint pen he pulled from his shirt pocket, the only pen he had. Thomas had kept the record for 50 years. He had played it until it was nearly unplayable, then stopped playing it and simply kept it. He had moved 7 times, and the record had moved with him, always wrapped in the same cloth, always in the same position in whatever closet it lived in. His wife had asked him once why he never sold it when they needed money, and he had told her he didn't know how to explain why, but that he couldn't. She had not asked again. He was standing in this shop in Philadelphia on a Tuesday afternoon in November because his wife had died in September, and the apartment felt different now, felt like a place he needed to change in some way he couldn't fully identify, and he had begun going through things and had come across the record and had thought, not for the first time, but with new urgency, that perhaps it was time to understand what it was actually worth. He had not expected to be told it was fake. He looked at the dealer. The dealer was already looking back at his computer screen. "The pen was blue," Thomas said, "because it was the only pen he had." "Sir," he pulled it from his shirt pocket. "It was cold that night, I remember, and he was wearing a flannel shirt. and the pen was in the breast pocket. There were 5 of us waiting. He signed all 5. I was the last one. The dealer looked up again. There was something in the old man's voice that he had not heard there before. Not defensiveness, not the desperation of someone trying to inflate the value of a cheap item, but the flat specificity of someone recounting something they had actually witnessed. "What venue?" the dealer said. "Paramount Theater, Asbury Park, March 1973. The dealer was quiet for a moment. He reached under the counter and pulled out a reference book, the kind that serious dealers kept for exactly this reason. He flipped to a section, ran his finger down a page. His expression changed slightly. "There was a small run of shows in early 1973, he said, almost to himself. "Before the major label push. Asbury Park, venues under 500 seats. 200 that night," Thomas said. "Maybe less." The dealer looked at the signature again. He looked at it differently this time, not with the casual dismissiveness of the first examination, but with the attention of someone revising their initial assessment. He put on his loupe. He looked for a long time. The ink was blue ballpoint. The pressure was inconsistent. The way pressure is inconsistent when someone signs something with whatever pen happens to be available, rather than the practiced signature of a performer signing 10,000 items with the same instrument. The slope of the letters was slightly different from the standard authenticated examples in the reference book, because it was from 1973, and the signature had not yet settled into the form it would take over decades of use. The dealer set down the loupe. "Where did you say you were standing?" he said. "By the stage door, south side of the building." He came out with his guitar case. "How long did you wait?" 40 minutes, maybe 45. My friends had already left." The dealer looked at the record for a long moment. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he did something he almost never did in the middle of a transaction, which was to close his eyes briefly and recalibrate. "I owe you an apology," the dealer said. "I made an assumption based on the ink color without considering the date. Pre-1975, there are documented examples of him signing with whatever was available. Blue ballpoint is unusual, but not impossible, especially for a small venue signing in 1973. Thomas looked at him. "This may be authentic," the dealer said. "I'd want to have it professionally authenticated, which takes time. But if it is what you're describing, a pre-fame signing from a documented early show, you're not looking at $40. Thomas picked up the record. He turned it over in his hands the way he had been turning it over for 50 years, with the particular care of someone handling something irreplaceable. "What am I looking at?" he said. The dealer named a number. Thomas listened to the number. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you already believed but could not prove. He did not sell it. He thanked the dealer, wrapped the record back in the cloth he had carried it in, and walked out of the shop onto the street. It was a cold Tuesday in November in Philadelphia, and the street was busy with the ordinary movement of people going about their business, none of whom knew that the man walking among them was carrying a piece of vinyl from a room in Asbury Park in 1973, where something had been beginning and he had been present for it. He stopped at the corner. He stood there for a moment in the cold. He thought about his wife, who had never quite understood why he couldn't sell it, and whom he had never quite been able to explain it to, and who had trusted him anyway. He thought about the 40 minutes by the stage door, and the 4 other people, and the flannel shirt, and the blue pen pulled from the breast pocket. He thought about the way the room had felt that night, the way certain rooms feel when something is happening that hasn't been named yet. He put the record under his arm and walked to where he had parked his car. On the drive home, he stopped at the cemetery where his wife was buried. He sat in the car for a while. Then he went in and stood at her grave for a few minutes without saying anything. He told her finally that the dealer had thought it was fake. He told her the dealer had been wrong. He told her he was sorry he had never found a better way to explain what the record meant, or why he had kept it through 7 apartments and 43 years, and everything that came between the Paramount Theater in 1973 and a Tuesday afternoon in Philadelphia in November. He told her it was worth considerably more than $40. He thought she would have found this funny. He thought she would have looked at him with the particular expression she had used across 4 decades when he said something she had suspected for a long time was true and was glad to have confirmed. And she would have said, "I know. I always knew." He drove home. He put the record back in its cloth and back in its place in the closet. He made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table and washed the dishes and sat for a while in the chair by the window where he always sat in the evenings. The record stayed where it had always been. Some things, Thomas had learned, were not for selling. Not because they had no value. The dealer had made clear they had considerable value, but because there were certain objects that carried something that the transaction would remove, and what they carried was worth more than what the transaction would provide. He had been in that room in Asbury Park in March of 1973. He had waited 40 minutes in the cold. He had watched a 23-year-old man with a guitar case and a blue ballpoint pen sign 5 records for 5 people who had stayed. He had been one of the 5. That was the whole value of the thing. Not the ink, not the sleeve, not the number the dealer had named. The fact of having been there, and having stayed, and having been the last one in line. There is something about the authentication process that the dealer set in motion that Thomas did not find out about until 3 months later, when a letter arrived at his apartment from a memorabilia authentication house in New York. He had not hired them. The dealer had, apparently, on his own initiative, submitted the record's details and photographs to the authentication house shortly after Thomas left the shop. The dealer had done this at his own expense, without telling Thomas, because something about the conversation had stayed with him in the way that certain conversations stay. Not because of the money, not because of the potential commission if Thomas ever decided to sell, but because of the specific quality of the old man's voice when he said, "The pen was blue because it was the only pen he had." The authentication house confirmed the signature as genuine. Their report cited the ink composition, consistent with early 70s ballpoint formulations, the paper aging of the sleeve, consistent with original 1973 pressing stock, and cross-referencing with 2 other known authenticated signatures from the same period, both of which showed the same pre-standardization irregularities in letter formation that the dealer had initially misread as evidence of forgery. The letter also included a note from the authentication specialist, a woman named Carol Firth, who had been working in music memorabilia for 15 years. The note was brief. It said that in the course of her work, she occasionally encountered items that told a story beyond their monetary value, and that this was one of them. She said the signature was not just authentic, but rare. Pre-fame, small venue, documented show provenance, signed with a pen that happened to be in a shirt pocket rather than the standardized instruments of a later career. She said she had authenticated thousands of items, and that perhaps a dozen of them had made her feel, reading the paperwork, like she could actually see the room where it happened. She said this was one of the dozen. Thomas read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then he folded it and placed it inside the cloth with the record, where it has stayed since. He called the dealer the following week, not to discuss selling, but to thank him for sending the letter. The dealer said he wasn't sure why he had done it, except that it had seemed like the right thing. Thomas said he understood. They talked for a few minutes about the early Asbury Park scene, about the small venues and the specific energy of that period, about what it had been like to be in those rooms before everything got large and documented and officially historical. The dealer said he had been too young for that period himself, had come to Springsteen later, through the albums rather than the rooms. He said he sometimes felt like he had missed something by not having been there. Thomas said, "You were there every time you put the record on. That's the whole point of why he made them." The dealer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was a good way to think about it." Thomas agreed. He has told the story of that Tuesday in Philadelphia to 3 people since it happened. His daughter, who lives in Portland and called him every Sunday. His neighbor Frank, who was 71 and had his own relationship with music from that era. And the man who cuts his hair, who had asked one afternoon what he was thinking about and received a much longer answer than he expected. All 3 of them asked, at some point, whether he had any regrets about not selling. Thomas gave them all the same answer. He said he had kept the record through 7 apartments and 43 years, and a marriage and a loss, and a Tuesday afternoon when someone told him it was worthless. He said that at 63, with the apartment quieter than it used to be, and the kitchen chair by the window where he spent his evenings, the record in its cloth in the closet was one of the fixed points of his life. One of the things that had been there across all of it. He said you don't sell a fixed point. His daughter understood immediately. Frank thought about it for a while and then said he supposed that made sense. The man who cuts his hair nodded and said nothing more, which Thomas took as understanding of the best kind. The Paramount Theater in Asbury Park was demolished in 2015. There is a parking structure on the site now. If you drive past it, there is nothing to indicate what was there before. No plaque, no marker, no sign. But on a cold night in March of 1973, 200 people or fewer sat in that room and heard something beginning. 5 of them waited by the stage door afterward. One of them was the last in line. He is 63 now, and he lives alone in an apartment in Philadelphia. And on some evenings, he takes the record out of the closet and holds it for a while without playing it. He doesn't need to play it anymore. He was there. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with someone who has held on to something that everyone else said wasn't worth keeping. Have you ever had something dismissed as worthless that turned out to mean everything? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to ring the notification bell for more stories about the moments that remind us why music exists.